Well, welcome back to Burnley. And the other year, I was at the top of Rosendale Road with the drone, and I talked about the old Broadhead Moor Colliery, or what I believe was the old Broadhead Moor. Now, what I'm going to do today, or try and do today, is get back up there because I found something on the drone that looked like an old shaft. I tried to get back about October time, but I had Morgan with me, and there looked to be a load of cattle on the field. So I'm going to go and ask permission first before going on. So we may or may not get on there. But since then also, I've done research on old maps and found some other newspaper reports about when the Hargreaves first had Habergham Colliery here. One newspaper goes back to 1832, and a really interesting, fascinating account of a dispute over poaching coal. And also some maps have been released, and it shows tramways on it. I've already talked about the tramway that went from here across to Cherryfold and then down to Barclay. Well, one went to Barclay Hills, another one took a different direction down to Gannerstade. But this map, and then looking on an old colliery plan, shows another tramway that runs from just above what used to be Riley's estate right down to the canal, going through, I would imagine it's sort of just near the crematorium, and it's the canal just more or less opposite with the old Apton Valley Pit Road. So I never knew about that before. So I'm going to go and try and get permission for a start to find this old shaft, what I think is part of the old Habergham Broadhead Moor pit. So far it's not as obvious as I thought, but if we look in the stream here, is that a bit of crop edge? There's a lot of coal amongst that. Just a bit further down there was ironstone and shale in the clough down there, so it looked really obvious when I looked last year. Maybe I just need to go further up, but it certainly looks like a bit of crop edge coal here, but that's without looking on the geological survey. And if it is a crop, I don't know, it's probably more likely to be dandy here, I would think. Could be wrong. I'm taking this to be the place. It doesn't look as defined as it did on the drone, but looking at it on LiDAR as well, and it looks like there's a channel coming down. I thought perhaps a wheel race, water leak coming in to feed a water wheel maybe, but if we look here we can definitely see where there's been a shaft. Here we go. Very shaft-like. Although there's a bit of a drop on the other side, and then we've got another depression there, and it looks like a defined sort of roadway or raised ground, certainly going down that direction. Maybe if we can get the drone up again and have a better sort of look from the air, that might help. Well, it does certainly look very shaft-like, doesn't it? It's built up around it, but it's not as defined as perhaps I thought it was going to be. Now, well, I think there's the shafts amongst all that gorse there. And this is where the channel comes down. Could there be in a water wheel pit? I know I'm sort of like guessing, but there's certainly been something here. And on one of those old maps, it does show some buildings up here and a bit of not an enclosure, a compound of some sorts. I mean, plenty of bits of coal here knocking around, and it's definitely been something. That's certainly got to be a shaft. And like I say, if we get the LiDAR up again, and you can see a defined channel coming down. Plenty of coal knocking about, actually, there's loads and loads of it. When you do get a look at it, that could be the shaft, that depression there. Am I reading into it maybe a wheel pit? I don't know. Or could that be the remains of where a gin was, maybe even? I'm not the world's best archaeologist at this. that site up there is absolutely fascinating, and I'm glad I saw it from the air. Now if that was your land, I did knock on quite a lot of doors to try and find out whose land it was, so I apologise if I've caused any harm. If you know, well, I haven't caused any harm, but if you wonder why I didn't ask, I just wasn't sure whose land it was. How old is that site? We just don't know. The two blacksmiths, they go back to the mid 1400s. Possibly they were further down in the clough. We just don't know. But as I mentioned at the beginning, we've come across some different documents, some newspaper finds and some other maps that bring us back to a later development on the old Broadhead Moor as it became Habergham Colliery, not to be confused with the Habergham pit down in Padiham. And then later on it was known as the Berkeley Hills. So what have we found? Well, as I mentioned on the last video I did when we talked about the pits down in Burnley Centre and the birth of the Hargreaves, James and John, they were sometimes known as the Habergham and Marsden Coal Company, and this is where, it mightn't have been Coal Company, but it was Habergham and Marsden was in the title, and this is where the Habergham comes from. And according to the source I've got, it's a newspaper dated October of 1832, and it states that the Hargreaves took out a 21-year lease of the Habergham Colliery back in 1828. Now, the newspaper is all about a court case and poaching coal, and it pertains to the Habergham Colliery and the Riley estate. Now Riley's farm is on all the old maps. Sadly now it's disappeared. The estate has gone beneath the industrial estate. However, there is stuff in the archives at Preston pertaining to the Riley estate which I haven't seen yet, but I need to go and find out. Now from what I know, the coal on the Habergham estate, it was advertised for lease by either the Earl of Montague, which became the Duke of Buccleuch, and I have a newspaper date for that. I'll dig that out. So part of the Habergham estate was owned by the Duke of Buccleuch, and perhaps when I get to the Records Office again and look at Berkeley's maps, there might be more on this area. So at present we're just in the dark with that little bit. Well, the coal on the Riley estate is obviously separate, and it is owned by the owners of Riley's, and other people were working that coal. And this newspaper article tells us not only who was working at the time. It was John Cross and a John Heslip. I hope I pronounced that right. It's like Hayslip how it's written, but I'm presuming it's Heslip. They're actually working the coal. I think they had a 4-year lease on it, but it tells us who was working the coal, not just before them, but before them even back still. Now the owner of the estate was a guy named Mr. Clegg, and he had leased out his coal to Cross and Heslip, and it seems a lot of money, £4,000, which was working out around about £500 per half year. It seems, going off some of the Rosendale pits, it seems an awful lot of money. So previous to those two guys leasing it, the pit had been leased by Eastwood and Clayton, and before them by a guy named Lancaster. Now it seems these were short leases. Obviously Hargreaves had taken out a 20-year lease. It looks like these were just leasing for 3 or 4 years at a time. But what they did, they were poaching coal off Hargreaves. Now there's two seams here, isn't there? There's the Dandy and there's the Arley. And Colonel Hargreaves and company, they were just interested in the Arley, but they'd put the Dandy to one side, if you know what I mean. They'd sunk down to it, there was a shaft to it, but they weren't working it at the time because it was nowhere near as valuable as the Arley. So they were getting the best first, and then if needs be they'd come back for the Dandy. So they filled the Dandy shaft in. However, it looks like Hayslip and Cross were working the Dandy, and their shaft down into it was on the Riley estate. Now when they took over, the pit had been dialed, had been surveyed, and it was as though there was maybe 18 yards between the two colliery boundaries. Now prior to Heslip and Cross taking over the pit, James Clayton, who was then the leasee along with Eastwood, he says Heslip came along and he went down and he dialed the pit. So in the trial, this is a proper trial, when it went to court, Heslip, both of them, Cross and Heslip, are talked of as master colliers. but it looks like Heslip really was the collier, and he took on the managerial role, and Cross, well, he was more on the surface. And why it's so important, and probably why it came to such an importance as a trial, was because an act had been changed by Peel, who was then Home Secretary. Now before that, trespass was just seen, well, it was just that, trespass, but Peel changed things, and that now became a felony and punishable by perhaps transportation and certainly imprisonment, so the stakes were quite high. Now when Heslip had dialed the pit, while James Clayton still had it, he said there were 18 yards to the boundary with what would have been Hargreaves' coal. So that there's not a great deal left, is there? So Heslip's working away, they take control of the pit, and by December 1831, Hargreaves are getting a little bit suspicious, because they're thinking, how come all this coal's coming out the pit? Because he only had 18 yard all across the boundary left, and apparently they were producing a lot of coal and undercutting the Hargreaves. So that is why in December suspicions were up. Now it was an unwritten law, if you will, or a code of conduct back in those days, certainly where coal boundaries were concerned, that different companies were allowed access into each other's pits so they could survey proper. They just used mariners' compasses and things like that in those days. So they would survey from one pit and then go down their own pit and survey, so they'd get an accurate plot, if you will, of how much coal was left and where the boundary was. But on this occasion now, when Colonel Hargreaves had got himself all of a fluster, Heslip said, "You ain't coming down here, son." And of course, Hargreaves weren't going to like that. In fact, it stated that he sort of kind of swore that if it cost him £1,000, he'd find out how much coal they'd taken off him and he would sue them for it. So what did they have to do? Well, they had to reopen that old dandy shaft that had been filled in, and it cost between £80 and £90 to do that. But that's exactly what they did, and they set the road surveyors down and they dialed, and they found out that Hargreaves' coal had been encroached by at least 20 to 30 yards, at least, because Heslip had been rather clever. It wasn't just an oversight, it was done on purpose. But it's hard to imagine all that mining activity was going on under here over 200 years ago, and there was an engine shaft just along here, and sadly, well, the industrial estate has taken it all, but it's still providing employment, isn't it? At the time of the trial, plans were shown to the judge and everybody. Whether those plans are still in existence, they could be at Press and Records Office, I don't know. So the exact location of this sort of shindy, again, we don't 100% know, but in the court trial it talks about on the Riley estate heading towards Will Hayes' Highfield or his Lowfield. So if we find that on the old tithe map, that'll tell us, to give us an idea. In fact, Heslip talks about breaking into there, holing in, because then they get plenty of air. Now it also talks about when Clayton had the pit, or Lancaster before him, that they couldn't have gone that far. They couldn't have been responsible for the poaching, because it says there's no railway laid. So do they mean surface railway? Are they talking about rails underground? So that's taking us back maybe to the mid-1820s, and there's no rails laid underground. Any road. When Hargreaves and Co got into the pit and they started dialing, they found out all this coal had gone missing. And it turns out some of the colliers actually had worked in both pits. It worked for Heslip and worked for Hargreaves as well. And it does talk about one pit being worked by just 4 colliers. So some of the men, when they got in there and they started investigating, they came up to workings they'd in fact driven, so they knew that they were theirs. And what Heslip had kind of said, when some of the colliers had warned him that he were getting close to the boundary, or he crossed it, he sort of said, it don't matter, get in there, get the coal, they're never going to find out. And to make sure they weren't never going to find out, he came up with a cunning plan. Basically, they robbed the place. They took all the pillars out and let the place drop. But like one mining engineer said, he said it wasn't so much that the roof had fallen a lot, it was they had a lot of floor lift and you couldn't get in. So when they did investigate, they couldn't tell the exact measurements of what had been pinched because it had all fallen in, full of stife, and there was no roadway through. Heslop had been kind of canny. But some of the colliers knew it were their work. One of them, I'll put his name up, he especially knew it was his work because now we used to use nogs. Colliers were paid by the tub, and we would put a tally on each tub and we would call it a nog. So when it got to the surface, it had our number on. Now then, it looks like their nogs, although in the paper it says knobs, but it's got to be nogs. They just use sticks. They must have had a different pattern or a different inscription on each stick to show whose was whose. And the colliers got in and they saw their nogs still in the far ends. In fact, one collier even recognised it'd been his far end that he'd driven because he recognised some wood, some boards that he'd used as a landing plate to turn the tubs. Obviously, they didn't have cast iron landing plates in those days. They used wooden boards. So Heslop really was banged to rights, and there was enough people to sort of line up and say, yeah, he said, let's go and rob it and let the roof fall in. Obviously, he brought his own witnesses that said something different, but the judge wasn't buying it. And all in all, they could prove that he pinched about 5,000 loads. Now, the two guys were given chance and opportunity to speak for themselves at the end of the trial. And Heslop basically just said it were naught to do with him. All the coal had been got long before he arrived there. Cross, on the other hand, went into more details, and it looked like Cross had actually worked for Colonel Hargreaves beforehand. And he talks about the Will Hay field, that it belonged to Colonel John Hargreaves, and that it was one of his ideas to drive for it, again, because the pit had been abandoned and they could use it for air. And the guy that he told him to drive for it said, what, you want me to go all the way to Lancaster? In other words, to Lancaster Castle and jail. And Cross had sort of said, well, nobody's ever going to find out. It's right, it doesn't matter. And he remembered working for Colonel Hargreaves when there was 4 people working the pit. So that gives us a bit of an idea of the scale of it back then. Anyway, the summing up was that they didn't get away with it. Even though they brought their own character witnesses and their own witnesses, they were banged to rights with it. And the judge wanted to set an example. Always unfortunate when you're the one that the judge wants to make an example of. And the 2 of them were sent to Lancaster Castle for 12 months hard labour. So that's a little bit of an insight to what went on here, and a bit of insight into the Riley estate and the old Habergham Colliery. And in the court trial, it names many people that I haven't named here. I need to write it up. But it's interesting for people doing family history, family research, whose family may have worked at the pit and what jobs they had. Some are named as under steward, bottom looker, surveyor, and so forth. In fact, when I was looking into Hall Fold Colliery, there was 2 Watson families that went to Whitworth from Burnley. One from over near at Fighting Cocks, and another that lived they lived at Stoops. And I've always wondered if those that lived at Stoops previously, because they were coal miners, had actually been at the old Habergham, or the old Broadhead Moor as it was. Any road, I'm going to go and have a look for this old tramway that ran down from Hargreaves' pit on Back Lane. Because as we know, we'll show it you on the map, he was working shafts on this side of Rosendale Road, a tramway going across to the shaft at Cherryfold, where one of his pit heads was, and then down to the canal wharf at Ganna. But it's not the one that went through Berkeley Hills. There was 2 separate tramways. And also this other map that's shown up, as I said, shows this other tramway going near Riley's, through towards where the crematorium is, and to the canal banks down near Abton Valley Pit Road end. So I'm going to have a look for that. But I hope you've enjoyed, in the meantime, this bit of a little bit of an update onto what we've found out about up here. So let's have a bit of a look at this the old map, and what I'll do, I'll show you how to get onto it. So we find the National Library of Scotland's website, click on there on their home page, and here we find Map Finder with outlines. So if we click on that, and that takes us to that grid. But if we look up in this left hand corner, click on Ordnance Survey there, browse all maps. Now it goes all through the Scottish maps for a start, you can't help that, and then we come to the map series England, Wales and Great Britain, and then you scroll down to find your various maps. Now we're looking for this really old 1-inch version, aren't we? And here it is, Ordnance Survey, 1-inch maps, England and Wales, all series, 1801-1869. Give that a click. Graphic index, or we can do a seamless layer on a satellite, but the map's that old it's not 100% accurate, so we'll go to the graphic index on this one. And we get a grid like this. So this is the area we want to be. This is a 6-inch, well, the 1-inch map we want. So if we click on that, it takes us to this menu here, which is just out of your shot. But we open the map up and we'll find our place. Now there's lots and lots to explore on this website, Scottish Library Maps. So just go and explore it, take your time, find out what there is. So here we are, I've got the section for Habergham Hall up, and the area that we're looking at. We're around this area, so we'll just enlarge it. And here we are. I'm always on the edge of a sheet. We're always living life on the edge. So here we go. Accrington, Aki Road, the Turnpike Road at the bottom. We've got Rose Grove down here. The railway has been put on the map, but we're here, aren't we? There's the Riley Estate that we were looking at. We're coming up what is, it's now Rosendale Road. It's not Rosendale Road on this map, but you get the idea. There was the main pithead for the old Habergham Colliery there, and these are the tram roads. Can we see them coming across Back Lane up to here? These are the working shafts that Hargreaves was working. Berkeley Hills, the modern Berkeley Hills from the 1840s is there, and there we've got the tram road. Obviously, like I said, we're on the edge of a sheet. There we've got the tram road running down to Ganastade. But like I said, there was 2 tram roads from here. One to the pit at the top of Cherry Fold. There's long lost that goes down here, and it shows it stopping there, but it actually does go to the canal at Ganastade there. Now then, our new tramway that we've just discovered, it's here. This is the Riley Estate. And can we see it running from these pits down here? Again, it shows it's stopping at the road, but it doesn't. It goes beyond the road. This is the area of the crematorium these days. It goes under the road, sorry, yeah, across the road, under the railway, and it's coming on this side of the railway. Like I said, Dickinson, I will say on the video shortly, Dickinson puts it on his map, and I never noticed it before. Here he is, Dickinson, putting it on his map. That is the first Ordnance Survey sheet. He doesn't show it all, but he shows this bit going down to the canal and with the other side of the railway. So there is a possibility then still that there might be something left. I don't get to it today. Let's look on the actual sheet. So where have we got here? We've got the Turnpike Trust, and it's coming across by the side of that T, isn't it? Which is there. So it's coming across, and actually it is where they're coming through the crematorium, really, to this sort of area. And we can see it on some of the colliery plans. But what shaft does it go to? Well, it goes to this shaft. Here we've got Riley's Estate, that's now well, we'll show you where Riley's Estate is these days. It's under that industrial estate. And our coal pit where the tramway runs to, there it is. See where that disappears to? It's all gone, hasn't it? Can we see these other engine shafts there? We've got an engine shaft, a reservoir for the steam engine, and the pit there. These have all gone. The industrial estate swallowed the whole lot, apart from this one here. And I haven't found that yet. I'm going to have to look for it. And we can trace it on the colliery plans. Here, the plan here is basically the last working plan of Berkeley Hills, and it doesn't show the previous lease. This goes from the lease in the 1840s, and the plans were always divided up. Look, so you got freehold land, copyhold land, and the plans really were to give people royalties. They weren't for colliery safety. That's what these plans are all about. So we see these old pits. This is actually where the tramway runs from. We can just see this dotted line here, and we can see the other old engine shaft that Hargreaves were working, and we've no information at all on the workings up here, which is pertaining to our story really.
and we come across, we've got a tramway coming across there to the old, what's known as the Cherry Fold Pit, which is where the school is today, 4-lane ends and what have you. And there's the older tramway running down to Ganastave. Can we see it? Shows it coming in there near Ganna Wharf, near Ganna Bridge. That was the coal stave, and that it was the more modern tram road going back to the Berkeley Hills Colliery that we know, which is just off Rosendale Road. It dates from the 1840s into the 1860s. So let's have a look at our other new tram road that we've discovered, although it's the older tram road. And it runs from this pit here. Can we see that dotted line? You can't see much, can you? We get to Lowerfold Farm and it looks like there's a bend in it there, so it's probably horse drawn. It's coming under Aki Road here in a tunnel. Can you just see the dotted line there disappearing? Coming under the tunnel here to the coal stave by the side of the canal, and we've just got these dotted outlines, and on other documents it does show a building. So that is a new tramway that we've found.
Well, I was slightly out with my calculations. The tram road doesn't come down to the opposite the Apton Valley Road end. That's near where the other bend is. It's more or less directly opposite the gates to the crematorium. So it's more than likely been totally destroyed, but we'll have a look anyway. I noticed on Joseph Dickinson's map that he's marked the bottom end of this tramway on, and it comes out on this banking somewhere. Now we've got it on Dickinson's map, we can overlay that on the Scottish library maps and then open it up onto Google Earth. Is there anything left? Well, it's on the wrong side of the towpath anyway, and we've got all this disturbed ground behind. But this is a location where that tramway from one of the Habergham pits came down. Was it Riley's or was it Colonel Agree's? We don't know yet.